Hello everyone and welcome to the latest episode of Real History. I am your host, History Professor Jared Frederick, and in this installment we are going to be taking a look at Damien Chazelle's 2022 comedy drama entitled Babylon, which is a look at the glitz and glamour of 1920s Hollywood. This is a movie known by critics for its excess, and we will see if that expectation matches reality here as I am watching it. In any case, I really enjoy period dramas. I enjoy movies about old Hollywood, and so I'm certainly going to give it the old college try here and try to offer some good historical and cultural context along the way. So for better or for worse, let's go ahead and take a look at Babylon. So one thing that I really like at the outset is this old logo for Paramount Pictures here at the outset. By the 1920s, Paramount, like most studios, were fairly young. Paramount was established in the year 1911. It was an operation that was known for its turbulence, its drama, a lot of infighting, charges of mismanagement. It starts to grow a lot then in the 1920s. It builds up its theater chains. Unlike today, most of the movie theaters were owned by the studios rather than concessionaires as such, if you will. And they were growing and growing and growing, and then the Great Depression hits. And so it was a thriving enterprise. It was not without its problems. The Great Depression puts the kibosh on a lot of its potential, and certainly they weren't alone in that regard.
I didn't know we needed one.
Can't drive an elephant without a permit.
Could we make an exception?
How's the guest list looking for tonight?
So it looks like we have the wheels being greased here, so to speak. A cop that is taking a bribe, and apparently this was not an uncommon occurrence in 1920s Los Angeles. And for some additional insight on this matter, I took a look at the book entitled Privileged Son, Otis Chandler and the Rise of the LA Times by Dennis McDougall. And this is what he has to say about this era coming out of Prohibition in the Roaring '20s. And he noted LA, by the mid-1930s, was a bit more sophisticated than it had been in the 20s, but it was just as much a haven for whores, pimps, con men, and gamblers. Only the police and City Hall middlemen role had grown more defined, intimate, and low-key. The city still played host to such renowned madams as Lee Francis, who had served champagne and caviar to visiting vice officers throughout the Roaring '20s, and Anne Forrester, aka the Black Widow, who took her nickname from her incriminating address book. Forrester's little black book contained the names and private phone numbers of many of the city's business elites, as well as LAPD brass, Commander St. Charles among them. And so perhaps there's a degree of realism to this wheeling and dealing that we see here. Man, when they say the Roaring '20s, they mean it, especially in this cinematic depiction. I mean, this is just a wild, all-consuming scene that we, the audience, are absorbed into. This incident supposedly has to do with an actor akin to Brad Pitt's character in this movie by the name of Wallace Reed, who a few years after this article met an untimely death in a sanitarium. But although the article doesn't mention him by name, it was assumed by many that it was in fact about him. And the article said this: Thomas H. Tyner, alias Claude Walton, alias Bonnie Walton, was taken into custody here on a local lot with 7 bundles of heroin on his person, according to the arresting officer. Tyner declared he was delivering the dope to one of the best-known male picture stars on the coast, and that had been the second time that he was engaged to deliver to the same star, whose wife, in the hope of having him break the habit, informed the authorities. So the likes of addiction here was a very real thing, and it had very serious consequences. But sometimes the Hollywood press had the ability to cover up identities as well as expose them.
Buonanotte, amore mio.
I believe it's pronounced Gorlami. That's the proper way to say it.
Problem.
We do?
Yep. This table only has one bottle. We're gonna need 8.
Ah, yes, the age of Prohibition. Prohibition, of course, had been enacted several years prior via a constitutional amendment. And by 1927, around the time that this movie is set, there were something akin to 30,000 illegal speakeasies located in Los Angeles alone. Why Prohibition had been enacted is that various civic advocates, various moral reformers, many of whom had just 7 years earlier obtained the right to vote, thought that alcohol was the root of all evil and that the only cure was a constitutional remedy. And of course, it's one of these famous ill-begotten experiments in American democracy where the ability or the effort to bring about change for the better ended up backfiring and had the opposite effect. But in Los Angeles, crime went up. You not only had the speakeasies, you had once reputable businesses such as wineries essentially being completely diminished throughout the 1920s, and by the time Prohibition came to an end, and everything had a price. The underground market, bootlegging, it was thriving, and all of this is coinciding with the rise of Hollywood and soon the emergence of talkies on the big screen. So it was a hip-hopping, barreling time in Hollywood at this given moment. This movie certainly doesn't shy away from some of that hectic nature.
And I love the thoughts it stirs, but I don't mind because it's hers. It's my girl's.
I have no doubt that the character of Lady Fei Zhu in this movie is a representation of actress Anna May Wong, who was one of the preeminent Asian American actresses in Hollywood at this time. And she had starred in a number of really prolific films like The Shanghai Express, The Toll of the Sea. Unfortunately, though, because of her race, she was denied a lot of high-profile leading lady roles within Hollywood. And if you want a rather interesting alternative history narrative that looks at her, you want to take a look at Netflix's miniseries called Hollywood, where there's a much happier ending for her than perhaps what she had in real life. So check it out. Wowza. I suppose this is the essence of female liberation in the 1920s. This is an incredibly exciting time for many American women. We have the emergence of this symbolic figure that is known as the flapper, a woman who wears a short skirt, learns how to drive, smokes in public, drinks, goes to college, experiments sexually, perhaps a little bit more adventurously than what her mother or grandmother did. It was an incredibly lively time, and we certainly get a sense of that likewise here in this film, but whew, holy cow.
Fine. Get the Wrangler. Jimmy, you carry the girl with me, then you drive her to the hospital.
Doubt she'll be able to work tomorrow.
What's her fucking problem?
No. She's in the bar scene at Maid's off.
This is undoubtedly supposed to be a fictionalized representation of the very dark case of the actor who was known as Fatty Arbuckle. And this guy was one of the top comedic performers in the silent era of Hollywood. But in the fall of 1921, he and some friends went to the St. Francis Hotel in Los Angeles, and he presumably he was accused of raping a young woman by the name of Virginia Rapp. And Rapp died as a result of this encounter. in no small part because part of her body was crushed as Arbuckle was committing this heinous act. So she dies in consequence. Arbuckle is put on trial multiple times, and on the third trial, he ends up being acquitted. And even though he is acquitted, it pretty much destroys his Hollywood career, obviously so. And he dies just about a decade later in 1933. And so some of these well-known Hollywood actors that had a lot to gain, well, they also had a lot to lose, and some of them did.
What the fuck?
So, the elephant arrives on the scene. And some of the opening moments of the movie, there's a very memorable moment with this elephant. To my great disappointment, though, I was unable to find any accounts within Los Angeles area newspapers in the 1920s testifying to an elephant being hauled up a mountain and taken to one of these galas. It certainly makes for a memorable scene in this movie, though.
We gotta redefine the form. The man who puts gasoline in your tank goes to the movies. Why? 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 Because he feels less alone there.
So ultimately here, Brad Pitt's character is talking about why we go to the movies, that we should aspire to these higher things, that they can be transcendent, that they can be artistic. Not everything has to be mush made for the masses. This is a message that is just as applicable to today in the 21st century as it was 100 years ago. Perhaps that's what Damien Chazelle is getting at.
Those dreams onto celluloid and print them into history. For the very first time, Eureka! I am not alone! Yeah.
Oh man. Okay, that was a funny scene. Yeah, after this sermon, we're taken back down to earth here. Man, I think this is one continuous shot. That's some great cinematography. And I love this glimpse into one of the early Hollywood backlots where there's just so much happening and they're filming like 8 different movies and they're doing it all on a shoestring budget. And they're out here in the desert and everybody's trying to break their way forward and they're taking drugs. And wow, like it's just this crazy environment that has this certain sort of creative energy to it. Some wild times here in 1920s Hollywood.
Manuel's great. Put Manuel on it.
You have experience with strikes?
Yes.
Okay, good. Well, these are all junkies from Skid Row, so they're pretty violent.
Who are you?
So as Manuel is going in here to break up this labor dispute, and as the extras are chasing him, we have reference to Skid Row. And Skid Row, by the late 1920s, was the largest and perhaps the most established homeless area in the vicinity of Los Angeles. And I think at any one given time, there were 10 to 15,000 transients and hobos that were living there at any one time. And this was considered a prime venue for Hollywood casting directors to go for extras. It's where people who were down on their luck could get a day's pay, get a hot meal, but conversely, they didn't always have rights and there wasn't always the best safety standards incorporated to offer them protection. And so they had a good right to be angry here. Perfect classical music selection here, playing in the background at night on Bald Mountain, if I'm remembering correctly. And this speaks to the era of the historical costume epic, where sometimes with these silent films you have a cast of hundreds or thousands of people fighting in the background, but they could be very dangerous circumstances at the same time, regardless of how magnificent they look on the big screen. Speaking to the danger of working on these adventure films or big epics as such, I found an article from 1930 that really gets to the heart of the matter. And it says, inquest conducted into fatal collision during film stunt at sea. And this is from the Los Angeles Evening Express. And it says, funeral services for Kenneth Hawks, motion picture director, were held today as an aftermath of an accident last Thursday when two airplanes locked wings and fell into the Pacific Ocean near Point Vicente while filming an air stunt. Hawks, member of a prominent Pasadena family, was a husband of Mary Astor, film star, and shortly before his death became the brother-in-law of Bessie Love, also a star who married William Hawks. So even high-profile people were being killed as a lot of these big-budget epics were being produced.
The end. Earp, for the Clayton movie.
Sir, I think your tent's in the line of fire.
Oh, they'll edit out in post.
Well, I think we could get hurt.
Jack, every time you wear a prosthetic, we lose the money.
Fireworks shot is too
expensive, and you'll never get Gloria Swanson.
Why no Swanson?
All right, we have reference to Gloria Swanson, who was under contract with United Artists at this time. And she, too, was one of the big Hollywood starlets of the 1920s. One of the top paid actresses. Worked in a number of Paramount pictures prior to this time. But like I think this movie is going to reflect upon further, with the disappearance of silent films, her career shrunk with that. Although she did gain a lot of notoriety a number of years later when she played the former washed-up actress, a version of herself, if you will, in the 1950 movie Sunset Boulevard, which is one of the absolute best movies about Hollywood that there is. And I suspect this movie is going to reflect on a lot of the same themes about how the system uses these people.
She'll do it for cheap. Now take the money I saved you and put it towards the goddamn fireworks shot.
These horses! Motherfuckers! Is that the last one?
I love the German director here, screeching, played by another director himself, Spike Jonze. And in the silent era and going into the 1930s, we have a lot of big up-and-comers who are arriving on the scene. William Wyler, Ernst Lubitsch, Michael Curtiz. These were guys who were going to completely rebrand the Hollywood system and what it meant to make cinematic art. And all of them were getting their beginnings, their starts, at this rather rocky time as the industry is transitioning from silent to sound. Great little incorporation here, along with the diatribes.
Music!
I like the live orchestra playing here in the background to set the scene. I don't know if anything ever to that extent was done, but it's certainly in the realm of possibility. If you know, I welcome your input in the comments section below. You know, I must say, these celluloid recreations that we see here are some of the best that I've ever seen in a movie that tries to recreate that certain look. So often they are done so poorly, and it is so obvious modern, meant to look old-timey, but this actually does a quite good job of it from an aesthetic point of view.
You can go in.
I thank you.
I suspect that Margot Robbie's characterization in this movie is supposed to be a recreation of the very famous Hollywood actress Clara Bow, who likewise worked for Paramount during this era. But she, all things considered, she had a very short career. It only lasted from about 1927 to 1933. She starred in the very first Best Picture winner at the Oscars, and that was the World War I aviation movie Wings. And she was just as hot as an iron out of the oven here at this given moment. But like so many other starlets of the time, it was something that simply would not last.
You ain't heard nothing. You want to hear Twitter?
Like, can you imagine the day of when people were wearing tuxedos and fine dresses to go see a movie at one of these big old classical debuts? It must have been something magical for the people who were there to experience all of this. But in this scene, of course, we see our introduction to the first big talkie, and that is the 1927 film The Jazz Singer, starring Al Jolson. Now, not the entire movie was with sound. Not all of it had audio. By and large, only his song and dance numbers, his performance sections, were included with audio. But in any case, as we see in the reaction of the audience here, it was a turning point. Nothing would ever be the same. It was full speed ahead, and audiences, as depicted here, were absolutely ecstatic.
Shut up! Are you fucking shut the fuck up! Not how we make movies! Shut the fuck up! Shut up! Shut up! Shut the fuck!
So we get a sense here that there are some growing pains in this process of transition. The sound equipment is very delicate, very much a big learning curve associated with all of this. And boy, there's some colorful language here being expressed in this moment of frustration. Speaking to this sense of transition, frustration, and uncertainty, I found another really interesting article. This one is from November 4th, 1928, and it's by a columnist by the name of Edwin Schallert. And in writing this in 1928, this is what he predicts. 2 years from now, 50% of the players who are appearing in pictures will be off the screen. The talkies will bring this about. Future pictures will either be all silent or all talking. But 2 years from now, there will be fewer films made than today. The reason is that the bad talkies will not enjoy success henceforth. People will walk out on them. If a silent film is bad, audiences sleep through it, but they won't be able to sleep through talkies. The theater used to be one of the fine places to sleep, but it isn't anymore. That's a great primary source here of this pivotal moment in film.
You can call my offices. We're gonna need more musicians. You're talented, man.
Mrs. Thalberg.
Yeah, all right, I'm gonna go throw up now.
So the name Irving Thalberg was passed around here in conversation among some of the characters. And this was a man who was a force to be reckoned with in early Hollywood. And unfortunately, he passed away at age 37. Perhaps never had the opportunity to reach his prime that otherwise may have been attained. But this is a guy who did Grand Hotel, Mutiny on the Bounty, The Good Earth is another good one that he did. Just some of the real classics of the 1920s and the 1930s. And this was a guy who was done too soon.
Once more to the breach, dear friends! Once more! Ready, hold it,
all this daring and all these conversations about snakes. Believe it or not, I was able to find stuff similar to this in the period newspapers of the time. This is from July 13th, 1927, for as unlikely as this may seem. From Riverside, California. Most of the stories told and written about snakes are fairy tales, explained E.J. Bryan of Riverside as he juggled an armful of lively California reptiles. Bryan conducts a snake farm in his back lot and has scores of rattlers, king snakes, gopher snakes, and other crawlers particular to the hills and valleys of the state. The commonly believed story that a king snake will conquer a rattler is to be tried out Wednesday evening at the American Legion Club on Lake Evans. Brian would not say if he really expects the two to carry out their part of the program. So, you know, we had snake fights going on here and all this sort of wild cockamamie stuff that's happening here. So, man, the wonders that one can find in period newspapers. Sometimes truth is stranger than fiction.
I have to do this.
Singing in the Rain was a popular song of the 1920s, and there were these troops and performers who would put on skits. They'd even dress up for radio performances, even though the audience couldn't see them. And they were wearing rubber raincoats and hats exactly like the ones that we see here. And of course, I suspect that this is going to be an homage of sorts later on for the 1950s musical Singing in the Rain.
You're asking me what I think?
Yeah.
This looks much better. I think you got those cameras pointed in the wrong direction. We do the rainbow, remember? Big on.
This point about the cameras pointing in the wrong direction, I think, is a very revealing and valid one. Because by showing these big bands, jazz bands, swing bands, by putting them in front of the camera and showing their artistry, it captured the imagination in a way that people dancing around like penguins in rubber raincoats could not achieve. And this is what allowed some of the big African-American artists of the 20s and 30s to break their way into Hollywood. People like Louis Armstrong, people like Cab Calloway, who stars in a number of films while standing in front of his big band. This was yet another transitional moment in the story of mass entertainment because it was really one of the few opportunities that black performers had to get into the mainstream. But sometimes that came at a cost.
I've known loss. I've known pain. It's you who gives me life.
So now we're in the year 1930. America is thoroughly within the Great Depression by this time. A quarter of the country is unemployed. A fifth of the country can hardly feed themselves. And this, in turn, hurt Hollywood because fewer and fewer people could actually afford to go to the movies. For those who did want to go to the movies, they would often go and see these extravagant musicals. Something that would allow them to escape the daily dreariness of their lives during the Great Depression. And so movies continue to play a popular role in American society, but the tastes, the attitudes shift substantially as to the expectation of audiences. And of course, all of these changes didn't benefit old silent film stars who are struggling to make their own adjustments as well. With the audience laughing at Brad Pitt's performance here, it was something that was very real. And it speaks to the hurdles that these former A-list box office celebrities had to overcome. Some of them simply couldn't overcome it. And it reminds me of another movie, and that is the modern silent movie, The Artist, that looks at this exact same thing. That's a better movie. You should check that one out as well.
And they won't get paid. You're an actor now, Sydney. Actors change their appearance for roles.
The history of blackface, of course, is a very unfortunate one, but it was one that was long ingrained in the idea of mass entertainment. And it went all the way back to antebellum days where white people would put shoe polish or charcoal, like we see here, on their faces, and they would mimic what they thought was slave or African American dialect. And the story goes, akin to like what we see here, is that sometimes African-American performers themselves would have to make up themselves in order to blend in with everybody else who was pretending to be African-American, but in actuality was white. Some of that may be kind of lost on the audience that we see here because we don't actually see any of the other performers that he is sitting alongside. But in any case, blackface was something that was very prolific well into the 1940s, and then finally after World War II it starts to dissipate as a more robust civil rights movement emerges after that global conflict.
Jim, this is Manny and the Count.
And speaking of the Great Gatsby, here is Tobey Maguire. This is a weird role for him. I think it's going to get weirder and weirder.
I got more ideas. You ever heard of Wyatt Earp? He died a couple of years ago. I met him once.
The reference to Wyatt Earp is likewise a good one throughout the 1910s and the 1920s. Wyatt Earp, the former lawman and gunslinger. Check out our episode on the OK Corral scene in the movie Tombstone while you're here on Real History. But Wyatt Earp went to Hollywood, and he was kind of a technical advisor of sorts on a lot of these early Western films. And what that allowed him to do was to cement and perhaps embellish some aspects of his life as a lawman and gunslinger. And of course, it's in no small part as a result of that that he is thought of as the ultimate persona of the cowboy era. And so some people get to write their own legacies, and to an extent, Wyatt Earp got to do just that. What in the hell is happening in this movie? This movie derailed. But it's, in any case, it's interesting that they show tunnels here, because there were stories of all these tunnels that connected various government buildings that were no longer in use, and these became safe havens for people doing these illicit things, and gambling and prostitution and drug smuggling and alcohol smuggling, bootlegging and everything under the sun. And so the idea of this shady underground, it's, you know, perhaps not out of the stretch of imagination, but man, this is some weird and twisted, perverted stuff that we see going on here in some of these scenes. Yep, we could perhaps see that coming. And of course, we often read of celebrity deaths, often in individuals who meet their end by their own hand. Once again, I just can't imagine some of the demands that some of these actors had to go through. It's very easy to just be like, oh, these people are millionaires, they don't have to worry about anything. But when you're in the public eye like that, the pressure that celebrity places upon one's shoulder is immense, I imagine. As we got a sense of with some of Brad Pitt's conversations with these Luella Parson, Hetty Hopper type tabloid journalist characters, what is expressed here is that oftentimes Hollywood just chews you up and spits you out. That is one of these universal themes of the entertainment industry that remains very valid here even over a century later. And so there's a lot of truth to these rather somber conversations here as we get nearer to the end of the film. Man, this has been a long movie with a very weird middle, but I do like this montage of archival footage showing the evolution of the industry as we get into the 1930s and onward. And what it underscores most is the inevitability of change. And not everybody can keep up with the change. And that's why some people are shoved aside, other people are absorbed in, and it is just a continuous cycle of people coming and going. And in that regard, it's like many different industries. Oh wow, so we've taken a big jump in time now, and we're in the year 1952. And unsurprisingly, this is another moment of transition, because it's now several years after World War II, and now Hollywood has to compete with television. And so we're going back to the big costume epics, the sword and sandal films as they were known. 3D movies are on the horizon. They're trying to figure out how can we get people back into movie house seats. And in 1953, we're going to see the introduction of widescreen films. Capture that bigger panoramic that can go along with some of those epics. And so once again, Hollywood is trying to reinvent itself. That is what we get a sense of, even in a subtle manner, as we see here.
The jazz singer. Oh, my darling little mammy, down in Alabama. No, this is no joke, Cosmo. It's a sensation. The public is screaming for more.
And as I sensed, we have this symbolic return to Singing in the Rain, the classic Gene Kelly musical. I think it's the best musical ever made. I'm not a huge fan of musicals, but that one is just so good. And I too have had the chance to see it on the big screen. It was utterly fantastic. Seeing that movie and the energy that it evinces, and what that does to an audience of 150 people, it is nothing less than magical. And that's why we need movie theaters, folks. I mean, we live in the age of streaming. We can watch almost any movie instantly upon release at home, but going to a movie theater, sitting among people, sharing the experience, it's so much better than just sitting on your couch with one or two other people. This is why we go to the movies. And this film, despite its many faults and digressions and wackiness, that's really what it's getting to in the end. We see all these classic shots of other movies, from Psycho and Ben-Hur and 2001: A Space Odyssey. Wow, this is very, very lively. Raiders of the Lost Ark, Tron, Terminator 2, Jurassic Park, The Matrix, Avatar. Wow, so you really, once again, it speaks to the inevitability of change, the magic of movies, and it always leaves us wondering what will come next. A very, literally colorful ending here. All right, so that wraps up this conversation on Damien Chazelle's Babylon. And I thought this movie had a very entertaining beginning that I think bore a lot of truth about Hollywood in the 1920s. I am completely puzzled, though, by the middle third of this movie and this descent into darkness and all of these really strange and convoluted and perverted things that were ongoing here. There's just a little bit too much excess in this movie. I mean, this is a 3-hour movie. I'm wondering what could have been done had the story been a little bit more focused, had it not tried to cover so much, if it wasn't so overwhelming on the senses at times. I think there was a potentially great movie to have been found within this film. It brushes up against these moments of greatness now and again, but it just doesn't quite hit the mark. All of that said, if you are a fan of classic film, if you like period dramas, if you like comedy set in other historical time periods, if you like just movies about Hollywood, what it takes to make movies, I don't think you'll be entirely disappointed by this film. But yeah, boy, I was completely bewildered at certain moments of this movie, and perhaps you will too, if you want to check it out. So once again, thank you for tuning in to Real History. We always appreciate your courteous comments and feedback in the section below. And while you're down there, also check out our website, realhistoryfilms.com. If you enjoy our channel, please become a member to support us on Patreon. Follow us on Facebook. Buy some nice history swag on our Real History store. We have a lot of great resources available for free via this channel And as always, we just really appreciate your support. Like this movie expresses, we're all about sharing our love of movies and offering those additional insights. So, until we see you next time on Real History, stay curious.